Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Sneaking in an extra show here, kind of related as a follow up to earlier's show today, where I was talking about the Sixth Ecumenical Council and Pope Agatho's presentation in defense of papal infallibility at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, Constantinople III, which is accepted by both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, but it poses a problem for Eastern Orthodox, as you can imagine, since the Pope is presenting papal infallibility at the council, and the council fathers, mostly made up of Eastern fathers, accepted papal infallibility at the council. And so I want to kind of do a little bit of a follow up to that in relation to a response that an Orthodox professor attempted to offer to this conundrum, because I'm always fascinated by Orthodox historians and professors, and trying to get their take on, especially Constantinople III and the Sixth Ecumenical Council. How do you reject papal infallibility when your own ecumenical council teaches it? What do you do with that? And usually what they'll try to do is go to Honorius, which doesn't help them escape the conundrum, as I'm going to show here in a moment. As a Catholic, I can make sense of that. As an Orthodox, however, I don't see how one can make sense of it. So I'm always fascinated to see what educated Orthodox historians and scholars and professors have to say about this issue. And there was a priest a while back, Orthodox priest, who asked his professor, Eastern Orthodox professor, about this. And what I'm going to read the response from the Orthodox professor, and I'm going to interact with it. The Orthodox professor has been teaching for over 40 years. Actually, it'd be 50 years. Over 50 years or so as an Orthodox professor. So he certainly knows his stuff. And he also has been doing so at a well-known Orthodox seminary. And so he's pretty high up when it comes to academics. But as far as his response, I think it's very telling. And that's why I want to read the response first. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through Agatho at the council itself, the Sixth Ecumenical Council. I'm going to walk you through it. Then I'm going to go over Leo II, the successor of Agatho. I'm going to go over his confirmation of the condemnation of Honorius. I'm going to speak about how everything we just read from Agatho is actually consistent with the later condemnation of Pope Honorius by the same council. So I'll show you how it makes sense from a Catholic perspective, but it doesn't make sense from an Eastern Orthodox perspective. And then I'll show how the Orthodox scholar offered an utterly deficient understanding of the Sixth Ecumenical Council in response to papal infallibility at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, again, Constantinople III. He says this. This is the professor when he's asked about the question of papal infallibility. What do we do with this as Orthodox? He says, it seems amazing that Pope Agatho can claim so unreservedly that his church had always kept the faith pure from any heresies whatsoever, when his own predecessor, Pope Honorius, only some 45 years earlier, was the very one who first asserted that there is only one will in Christ. In other words, the professor's like, it just doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense from the perspective that you're operating from, but it actually makes sense from a Catholic perspective. But he's admitting, like, yeah, Agatho is saying his predecessors were free from error, but he actually says more than that. He notes that the Roman See will always be undefiled unto the end, and guess what? The Council Fathers accepted that. You have to account for that. You can't just gloss over this and say, oh, well, Pope Honorius. No, not so fast. Your council accepted the words of Agatho. It's not just Agatho's words being presented. They're being read at the council and accepted at the council. The Council Fathers agree with him, not only in the claim that his predecessors were free from error, and that would include Honorius, but also the reason why, which is doctrinal in nature, as we'll see here in a moment. But what they'll do is the Orthodox will just skip over that. They'll just try to rush to but wait, Pope Honorius, hold on. No, you still have to get out of this conundrum because your own council accepted the claim that all of Agatho's predecessors were Orthodox. How do you explain that? Are you going to admit your council made a mistake? That they historically erred on a matter of fact? Are you going to admit that? Or are you going to say, no, they're consistent, but that their later on condemnation of Honorius is still somehow consistent with that? Well, okay, please explain that. I would like to see it. Generally, you won't get that kind of response, even from Orthodox professors. They'll just kind of check out on you. All right. And he says, and as we know, Pope Agatho's delegates ended up signing the doctrinal decree of the Sixth Council, which included a very clear condemnation of Pope Honorius. See how he just tries to make a beeline, doesn't really address the fact, but wait, your own bishops accepted the claim of Agatho that his predecessors were Orthodox. You got to deal with that. You can't just skip over it. It's a problem for everybody. So you need to address that, not just Catholics. And every succeeding new Roman bishop renewed that condemnation until the late 11th century when it was dropped during the era of the Gregorian Reform. And that was the end of it. So in other words, here's his response. Well, I don't know how to make sense of what Agatho is saying there. And I'm just going to make a beeline to Honorius and just try to, seek coverage there in the fact that Honorius was condemned. You'll notice he's, number one, not accounting for the fact that his own bishops accepted the claim of Agatho that his predecessors were Orthodox. And number two, he's not addressing the more important issue. And that is, Agatho is also teaching papal infallibility, and that papal infallibility is rooted in the promise of Christ in Luke 22 to St. Peter, and it applies to the apostolic see, that is the Roman see, and to all of his predecessors and successors unto the end, undefiled unto the end, because of the divine promise of Christ. That's papal infallibility, and it's in the context of faith and morals. It's not in the context of something else. So it's an indefectibility in his teaching office specifically, as we'll see here in a moment. So again, what do you have? You have a pope teaching infallibility, papal infallibility. The council fathers accepted it. They have no problem with what Pope Agatho says, not only about his predecessors, but also about papal infallibility. They accept it. Hook, line, and sinker. They're going for it. They say it's divinely inspired. We accept this. They write a letter back to Agatho, accepting his letter to the emperor, read at the council, teaching papal infallibility. Divinely inspired. We agree with it. They even appeal to his Petrine, his own Petrine privilege, and the fact that he is a successor of St. Peter, and they refer to his Petrine authority. So they actually agree with it. They never say, oh, no, we're going to contest that. No, they go with it. And it's not just a silence where, well, I don't really agree, but we're not going to rock the boat and, contest what the Pope is saying here. No, they're not only, just giving some kind of pious silence. They're coming out and openly saying, we agree with you. What you wrote is amazing. We even agree with your Petrine foundation. And it gets even more interesting when we look at Leo III and what he says whenever he condemns Pope Honorius, his predecessor. That's what's even more interesting. So in other words, the professor completely sidesteps the issue, doesn't account for the theology that's being presented at the council that explicitly teaches papal infallibility, and he doesn't properly try to harmonize his own council fathers that, yes, they later condemn Honorius, but he doesn't explain how, but they accepted Honorius as Orthodox in this session. How does that work? Did your council make a mistake here? Are the bishops errant in matters of fact? Well, from a Catholic perspective, one could argue that, but are you going to argue that? There are some Orthodox who would argue that. Metropolitan Hilarion is one of them. But there's plenty of other Orthodox who would say absolutely not. Even in matters of fact, they're infallible ecumenical councils. So, I mean, I'd love to see what he does to try to harmonize these things. Of course, he didn't even bother to do so. And again, that's very telling that an Orthodox scholar teaching in church history for decades can't grapple with this issue. Isn't that telling? It's not just him. It's a major problem in Orthodoxy itself. Let me do so, since he's not going to. Let me go ahead and show you how to harmonize them and to make sense of them from a Catholic perspective. Let me also walk you through the text, so you have a little bit of a better perspective of what we are dealing with here. Let me share my screen. Okay. Let's see here. It's not very large, is it? Let me try to modify this here. Let's see. There we go. Let me zoom in on this because that's still pretty small. Let's try a little more. Okay, let's start from. I know I went through this earlier today, but I'll go through it one more time just for those who didn't see the show earlier. Okay. Let's start around. There we go. All right. Let's start around here. This is, again, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, 680 to 681, accepted as an ecumenical council by both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. This is a letter. Pope Agatho sends a letter to the emperor. So we're about to read the letter that is itself read at the council. So you're reading the council reading a letter from Agatho written to the emperor. And they accept the letter. They receive the letter. It's divinely inspired. We agree with it. We're even appealing to your Petrine foundation and ministry. We're going with it. We're not accusing you of heresy by teaching papal infallibility. We're on board. This is what Agatho says, because he's trying to explain, look, all of you other sees, y'all have been in heresy. Y'all have been teaching heresy on the issue of how many wills does Jesus have, 1 or 2? He's saying, look, you other guys are in heresy, and y'all have fallen for heresy. But my see, that is the Bishop of Rome, the teaching authority of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, has not fallen into heresy on this issue, in any other issue. And the reason why Rome has not fallen into heresy, according to Agatho, is because Jesus promised infallibility to the successor of St. Peter in the Roman pontiffs. And it will remain undefiled unto the end in its teaching office, in its teaching authority. He says, this is the living tradition of the apostles of Christ. He's saying this is a tradition of the apostles. This isn't some post-apostolic revelation, which his church holds everywhere, which is chiefly to be loved and fostered. So this is the teaching everywhere. It's not just the teaching of Rome. It's the teaching everywhere, and is to be preached with confidence, which conciliates with God through its truthful confession, which also renders one commendable to Christ the Lord, which keeps the Christian empire of your clemency from far-reaching victories to your most pious fortitude from the Lord of heaven, which accompanies you in battle. Let's see. Lost my place here. Hold on. Far-reaching victories from your most pious fortitude from the Lord of heaven, which accompanies you in battle and defeats your foes, which protects on every side an impregnable wall, your God-sprung empire, which throws terror into opposing nations and smites them with divine wrath. I love the way that they sometimes speak of the empire, which also in wars celestially gives triumphal palms over the downfall and subjection of the enemy, and ever guards your most faithful sovereignty secure and joyful in peace. For this is the rule of the true faith. All right, so here's the faith, which this spiritual mother of your most tranquil empire. Who's the spiritual mother in context? Agatho identifies the spiritual mother as the Bishop of Rome in context. So he's saying Rome is the spiritual mother of the empire, and he calls it the Apostolic Church of Christ. So, and some might say, oh, but see, he's talking about the whole church, not just Rome. No. Not so fast. Not so fast. Keep reading. He's not talking about the whole church, because if he was talking about the whole church, that would mean that all the other bishops didn't fall into heresy. No, he's not talking about the whole church. He's specifically talking about the Roman bishops, and you'll see that here in a second. So just keep reading. Has both in prosperity and in adversity always held, and defended with energy, which it will be proved by the grace of Almighty God, has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition. Wait, what? So if you want to say, oh, well, that's for all of the other bishops as well. No, that doesn't make sense. They were clearly in heresy. So he's obviously not saying all of these bishops are somehow given this charism. No. And again, he's going to make it even more explicit that he's talking about Rome here in just a second. But notice this: has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition. And so we're talking about teachings here. We're not talking about something else. We're talking about faith and morals, teachings. So this never erring, this indefectibility is not some general indefectibility as the Protestant Gavin Wortland has tried to say. I don't know how he got to that if you just read it in context. He's talking about the teaching office specifically. What's the whole purpose of the letter? That it has never erred from the path of apostolic tradition in its teaching on two wills. Nor has she been depraved by yielding to heretical innovations. So she hasn't yielded to heresy. By the way, again, this is written by Agatho, who is several popes after Pope Honorius. By yielding to heretical innovations. But from the beginning of the church, she received the Christian faith from her founders, the princes of the apostles of Christ, that would be Peter and Paul, and remains undefiled unto the end. So he's not just saying that somehow Rome is Orthodox up until this period, but he's saying it's always going to be Orthodox in its teaching authority. It will always be consistent with the apostolic tradition, always undefiled unto the end. Not just up until that time. This is accepted by the Orthodox bishops at the council. They accept this. You have to deal with that. You can't just make a beeline for Honorius. You got to explain, why did the bishops accept papal infallibility here? Why did they do that? And moreover, it gets even more difficult because he's about to appeal to a divine protection of the papacy and then say that all of his predecessors were Orthodox, which would include Honorius. You have to deal with that as an Orthodox theologian and a professor. You can't just skip and say, Honorius, wait. But they're saying Honorius was Orthodox here. And later on, they're condemning Honorius. Please explain this apparent contradiction. Don't just gloss over it. According to the divine promise of the Lord and Savior. So Rome, in its teaching authority, remains undefiled unto the end according to a divine promise of Jesus himself. So it can't defect from the faith, not because it's great in the Roman Empire, it has a really prestigious place in the Roman Empire, it has a lot of martyrs, or it was established by the martyrs, Peter and Paul, but more specifically because of a promise that Jesus made to Peter and his successors, saying in the Holy Gospels to the prince of his disciples, saying, Peter, Peter, behold, Satan has desired to have you, that he might sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith fail not. And when you are converted, strengthen your brethren. Luke 22, he is applying that to his see as the successor of St. Peter. And don't say, well, every bishop is a successor of St. Peter. In a general sense, yes, but not in this sense. Not in that sense of having a divine protection to be undefiled unto the end in the apostolic faith. You really want to say that's true of every bishop? So no bishop has ever taught heresy. Obviously, you can't say that this particular Petrine privilege applies to every successor of the apostles. Clearly, you can't say that. This is something that is applicable only to the successor of St. Peter himself. That is the Bishop of Rome. How do we know that? Because he's going to tell us that. He's going to make it explicit. So I'm not reading into this. Let your tranquil clemency, therefore, consider, since it is the Lord and Savior of all, whose faith it is, that promised that Peter's faith should not fail, and exhorted him to strengthen his brethren. How it is known that the apostolic pontiffs, who do you think that is? Who's the apostolic pontiffs? Rome. Please don't say, oh, it's Alexandria. Oh, it's Antioch. Please. So Alexandria and Antioch never embraced heresy prior to Agatho. Is that your claim? They were just, that never happened. And is it also your claim that Alexandria and Antioch will also be undefiled unto the end from heresy? Is that also your claim? So you maintain papal infallibility for the successor in Alexandria and Antioch or Constantinople or wherever you want to transfer this thing to? Of course not. Orthodox don't accept papal infallibility for any see. Okay. So who are the apostolic pontiffs? Obviously, the apostolic pontiffs are the bishops of Rome. The predecessors of my littleness. He makes it explicit for you. Who are the apostolic pontiffs? His predecessors. Who are his predecessors? The bishops of Rome before him. It's so painfully clear. My predecessors in Rome. These are the apostolic pontiffs that have been given this promise by Jesus to remain undefiled unto the end in the apostolic teachings. This is called papal infallibility. That's why Orthodox scholars will generally recognize that, yes, you do have seeds of papal infallibility here. They just don't know how to reconcile that with Honorius. Well, I'll give you a way to reconcile it here in a moment. The predecessors of my littleness have always confidently done this very thing. They've always preserved the faith. They've always, all of his predecessors, that includes Honorius. Agatho is saying, Honorius, everybody, all of my predecessors in the apostolic see, they have all been undefiled in preserving the apostolic tradition, not only in this matter, but in all matters, undefiled, period. You have to deal with that. You can't just gloss over that as an Orthodox historian. You have to explain how your council fathers accepted Agatho's claim that Honorius was Orthodox, and all of his predecessors were Orthodox, predecessors who taught not only the papacy, but also the filioque. That's a whole nother issue. You have to explain that. You can't just gloss over the teaching of papal infallibility that they accepted here. And you can't just gloss over that Honorius was condemned sessions later. Explain, how were the council fathers consistent? Did they change their mind? Okay, maybe they changed their mind. Okay, but they were wrong then, right? So not everything in the council is infallible, right? You would have to take that position at that point. Okay, so what's infallible then? Only their teachings on faith and morals, not matters of fact. Aha. So you want to say, okay, well, maybe they can err on matters of fact, but they can't err on matters of faith and morals. But wait, is it a matter of faith and morals to teach papal infallibility? Yeah, that's a matter of faith and morals. So if they're infallible on matters of faith and morals, why don't you agree with them? And if you say, well, they made a mistake here in that teaching. Okay. Did they also make a mistake in their Christology? Upon what basis do you accept their Christology, but you reject their ecclesiology? These are things that Orthodox professors unfortunately evade, and they have to address. I'd love to hear them address it. Always confidently done this very thing, of whom also our littleness, he's saying himself, since I have received this ministry by divine designation, wishes to be the follower, although unequal to them, and least of all. So it's obvious he's talking about his see, Rome. For woe is me if I neglect to preach the truth of my Lord, which they have sincerely preached. And again, he's reasserting that they have preached the faith. Woe is me if I cover over with silence the truth, which I am bidden to give to the exchangers, to teach to the Christian people and imbue it therewith. And so on. Now, let's talk about several things here. But again, just to recap before we move on to the next part, I really want to emphasize two things here to take away. He's teaching not infallibility of the whole church. He's teaching the infallibility of the Roman pontiffs. That is abundantly clear in the context. He's teaching papal infallibility not as a post-apostolic doctrine. He's teaching it as something that goes back to Jesus himself in Luke 22. That is a claim on faith. That's related to faith and morals. That's a teaching of a council. The council fathers wrote a letter back. As you can just read the council for yourself, you'll see they wrote a letter back. We accept this. We love your letter. It's the best thing ever. It's divinely inspired. It's wonderful. Thank you for your Petrine foundation and ministry and so on. And they accept it. They don't say, no, that's heresy. You can't argue. Well, they thought it was heresy, but they didn't want to say it because they kind of needed him on their side. Excuse me? So they were cowards? So they failed to rebuke heresy at a council and instead accepted it? Is that really your argument? You would have to argue effectively that they were wrong in matters of faith and morals. Which again, I would then ask, okay, well, upon what basis do you accept their Christology and not their ecclesiology? That's number one, the teaching. And then number two, he is very confident in asserting that his predecessors were Orthodox and were never heretics. They did not teach heresy. He is very clear about that. He indicates all of his predecessors. The council fathers accepted that. In other words, they accepted that everybody before Agatho was Orthodox. That includes Honorius. You have to then explain how they go to condemn Honorius sessions later. You can't just wiggle your way out of it and pretend that doesn't exist and try to rest in the fact that they condemned the Pope. No. You have to explain the contradiction, alleged contradiction. Moreover, they're not operating apart from the Pope. It's the Pope who also condemns his predecessor. It's the Pope with the council who condemns Honorius. Let's look at that and let's talk about that. Let's first look at what the council actually says. I'm going to share my screen one more time. Should be able to see it now. Okay. Is that large enough? Let's see. Okay. Honorius condemned by the council as following. Here's how he's condemned. And I'll explain how I understand this as reconcilable with the Catholic position. The council says this: and with these we define that there shall be expelled from the holy church of God and anathematized Honorius, so a pope, who was sometime Pope of Old Rome, as opposed to New Rome, Constantinople, because of what we found written by him to Sergius, who was the patriarch of Constantinople, who was a heretic, that in all respect he followed his view and confirmed his impious doctrines. So the council fathers are saying Honorius followed Constantinople's heresy, insofar as Honorius followed the views of Sergius. The views of Sergius were to say that Jesus only has one will, not two wills, monothelitism, which is a heresy. And the council is condemning it. But again, those same council fathers just earlier said all of the predecessors of Rome were good to go. They're all Orthodox. Now they're coming back later. Honorius is thrown under the bus. Well, what took place? There was another bishop who was questioned and being thrown under the bus. And he's kind of like, well, why are y'all coming after me? I mean, Rome, Honorius taught this same thing. Why are you picking on me? And so then they're like, okay, well, I guess we gotta condemn Honorius too. Is that a contradiction with them in the previous session? You got to address that. You can't be evasive here. I'll explain how it all makes sense from the Catholic perspective in a moment. Here's what Leo II said, because this council was not operating apart from a pope. You can't have an ecumenical council ultimately without the pope, in one way or another, at the very least confirming it. And here's how the successor of Agatho, Leo II, confirmed the Sixth Ecumenical Council's condemnation of Pope Honorius, one of the predecessors before Agatho. Here's how. He says, my predecessor, Pope Agatho, of apostolic memory, together with his honorable synod, and by the way, Agatho is a saint in Eastern Orthodoxy. He's a saint. So your saint taught papal infallibility at an ecumenical council, and your council accepted it. Together with his honorable synod, preached this norm of the right apostolic tradition. So he taught the apostolic faith and the apostolic tradition on the issue of two wills, Agatho. This he sent by letter to your piety by his own legates, demonstrating it and confirming it by the usage of the holy and approved teachers of the church. And now the holy and great synod, celebrated by the favor of God, and your own has accepted it and embraced it in all things with us. In all things. They embraced the letter in all things. And by the way, again, read their letter where they tell you firsthand from their own mouth they accept everything. It's not just the Pope saying it. As recognizing in it the pure teachings of Blessed Peter, the Prince of the Apostle. Oh, well, I thought he taught the heresy of papal infallibility in there. That's interesting. Well, I guess papal infallibility isn't heresy according to this council. And your own has accepted it and embraced it in all things with us, as recognizing in it the pure teaching of the Blessed Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, and Pope Leo II, and Pope Leo discovering in it the marks of sound piety. Therefore, the Holy and Universal Sixth Synod, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which by the will of God your clemency summoned and presided, has followed in all things the teaching of the apostles and approved fathers, which would include their acceptance of papal infallibility. And because, as we have said, it has perfectly preached the definition of the true faith, which the apostolic see of Blessed Peter the Apostle, whose office we unworthily hold, also reverently receives. Therefore we, by our ministry, this reverend apostolic see, listen to the language. He's saying, by the authority of St. Peter that I have as the Pope, wholly and with full agreement, do consent to the definitions made by it, and by the authority of Blessed Peter do condemn them. He's appealing to the authority of Peter as the successor of St. Peter to condemn his predecessor, Pope Honorius. Just let that sink in for a moment. If Honorius taught heresy as Pope in his office as the successor of St. Peter, if he taught heresy as Pope, upon what basis can Leo II ratify this and declare it by the authority of St. Peter? It would seem that the appeal to the authority of St. Peter here would be pretty empty if it is vulnerable to heresy, right? Clearly, Leo did not think that Honorius taught heresy as teaching in his office of the successor of St. Peter. I'll show you in a moment how I believe he embraced heresy in Leo's mind. But it's certainly not as in his office as the successor of St. Peter. So, of Blessed Peter, do confirm them, even as we have received firmness from the Lord upon the firm rock, which is Christ. Wait, what? I thought Honorius was not firm. I thought Honorius was a heretic. And you're appealing to the firmness of Peter for your see? That doesn't make sense if he thinks that Honorius taught heresy as Pope. That doesn't make sense. Why appeal to the firmness of the rock of St. Peter when your own see has been sullied by heresy? In other words, this should cue you in that something is going on here that is not touching on papal infallibility. Something's going on here. that is not blemishing the teaching authority of the Roman See. That should clue you in. And in like manner, we anathematize the inventors of new error, that is Theodore, Sergius, Pyrrhus, Paul, and Peter, betrayers rather than leaders of the Church of Constantinople, and also Honorius. So he's saying Honorius is condemned. Inventors of new error, who did not attempt to sanctify this apostolic church with the teaching of apostolic tradition. So he's saying Honorius did not sanctify the Roman See with the apostolic tradition, but by profane treachery permitted purity to be polluted. That's interesting. Permitted purity to be polluted. Permitted. It's not necessarily the same as teaching. Now, some may argue, well, it could be permitting through teaching. I understand that. I'll explain why I don't think that's the case here in a moment. But it should also be clear in the context that's not the case, since he's appealing to the authority of Peter that the council has already accepted as infallible to condemn his predecessor. Clearly, what's going on in his mind, and I would also submit in the mind of the Council Fathers, is that they believed Honorius held to heresy. They believed he held, materially speaking, to heresy, that he believed one will, not two wills. But they do not believe that he taught it as the successor of St. Peter in his office. Otherwise, this makes no sense. Everything we saw from Agatho's letter also makes no sense. And also, they embraced a false teaching of papal infallibility. So, this is the only way to make sense of it. They believed that he materially, as an individual, a private person, maintained a heresy, but did not actually teach it in his office as the Pope, which is a distinction that we as Catholics recognize. You could have a Pope who is deficient in his theology. That's not the same as him teaching heresy. Those are two different things. Teaching heresy in your office is one thing. Being misinformed about theology privately as an individual is another. And we would say, okay, well, if somebody believes, monothelitism, maybe they don't know better. They believe Jesus has one will, but they don't know better. We would say materially there's heresy there. But are they formally a heretic? Not necessarily, unless they know better. And they're doing this knowing that this is heresy, and they're like, no, I'm going to persist in it. That then is formal heresy. That's also still distinct from teaching heresy in your office. Material heresy is one thing. Formal heresy is another. And teaching heresy is yet another thing. So it's clear to me, in the context, Leo thinks his predecessor, Honorius, was as a private individual in error. And he failed to speak the truth whenever Sergius wrote to him. In his mind, he thinks that he failed to sanctify the apostolic see because he permitted this error to grow and for confusion to grow by his use of the term one will. But he doesn't think that he taught it as the successor of St. Peter in his office as St. Peter, because, again, he's appealing to the office of St. Peter to back up this condemnation. And again, the office of St. Peter was just appealed to earlier to teach diothelitism. And it was appealed to as infallible in a divine promise of Jesus. So this is the only way to make sense of all the data. Unless you want to say they bought into doctrinal error in ecclesiology by embracing papal infallibility, or they just changed their mind and they contradicted themselves. Maybe they did contradict themselves on Honorius. If you want to take that route, okay. But you still have to explain the fact that they accepted papal infallibility. That still doesn't address that issue. But I'm not so quick to rush to they contradicted themselves. I think that they really thought that Honorius held to papal infallibility as in his private person, but we're making a distinction between that and what he taught in his see itself, what he taught as the successor of St. Peter. They're operating with that distinction in mind. Moreover, I would want to add in Honorius's defense, it's clear historically that he was not a monothelite. It's clear historically. He was not. By the council thinking that he held to monothelitism, they were in error. They were in error on a matter of fact. They were not in error on matters of faith. Their Christology is Orthodox. Their ecclesiology is Orthodox. Their acceptance of papal infallibility it's all Orthodox. But their assessment of an individual, which is a matter of fact and not faith, that is not divinely guaranteed. They can make mistakes on matters of fact. Councils did that. Sometimes they quoted somebody as Saint Basil and it wasn't Saint Basil, or somebody as Saint so-and-so and it wasn't actually them. It was actually a heretic who said it and it wasn't actually a saint. That happened. They didn't accept the heresy, but it so happens that they actually quoted a heretic. It's a whole nother issue. It happened pretty frequently, actually. They can make mistakes on matters of fact, not on faith and morals. Those things are protected by God. But it does seem to be the case that they misjudged Honorius in his private person, because even in his private person, he did not hold to monothelitism. And somebody says, but wait. He talked about one will. He talked about one will. Yeah, I know he did. But what did he mean by that? Not monothelitism, not the heresy of monothelitism, but the fact that the wills of Christ are in agreement. In the same way that we as Chalcedonians who believe that there are two natures in Jesus, we believe that that there's the human nature and the divine nature. They're not confused, they're not mixed, but they're also not separate. We would say they're distinct, but they're not separate. In the same way that we can use the Cyrillian formula that talks about one nature, but it's kind of a one nature of two natures kind of thing. In the same way that we can use that Cyrillian formula to articulate the Chalcedon's teaching, it's the same thing going on here. Even though at first it sounds heretical, like one nature. Wait, hold on. He has two natures. Yeah, it depends on what you mean by nature here. So when Cyril said that, he wasn't denying what would later on be affirmed by the Council of Chalcedon, two natures. Was it one nature of the incarnate word? I think was his formula. One nature of the divine incarnate word. Let me double check. One nature of the incarnate word. One incarnate nature of the word. Yeah, one incarnate nature of the word. Which Chalcedonians, we accept, yeah, okay, that can be Orthodox, even though it's like, at first it catches you off guard, like, wait, one nature, hold on. What do you mean by nature? Same thing here. Yes, Jesus has two wills. So when somebody says one will, hold on, wait, what do you mean by that? Well, what Honorius meant by that was not that he does not actually have two wills. He's saying perfect harmony. There's no contradiction in his humanity. And there's also no contradiction in his humanity versus his divinity. He's saying both. There's no internal struggle between concupiscence going on in Jesus because he doesn't have it. There's no fighting against that and wrestling around in his will on, well, do I embrace truth or falsehood? That's not going on with Jesus. And there's no conflict between the divine will and the human will. That is what Honorius was getting at. How do we know that? Well, number one, Maximus the Confessor, venerated by both East and West, tells us that. In his debate with Pyrrhus, the heretic, who's also condemned by this council here, well, he tells us that. So a saint is attesting to that. Not only that, the personal secretary of Pope Honorius testifies to that. So the personal secretary, the guy who knew Honorius, who wrote down the letters for him, the letters that allegedly teach monothelitism as a heresy, he says, wait, no, that's not what Honorius meant. He did not teach heresy. He wasn't teaching monothelitism. He's in a position to know that. Not only that, one of his successors, John IV, which is before Agatho and actually before the Sixth Ecumenical Council, but clearly after Honorius, John IV defended his predecessor, Honorius, as Orthodox, and explained everything that I just explained to you, and explained that's not what he meant by one will. He did not mean monothelitism. By the way, was any of this considered at the Sixth Ecumenical Council? No, not to my knowledge. I'm not aware of any evidence where they considered any of this. Maximus Honorius, his personal secretary, John IV, and so on. None of that was considered to my knowledge. It kind of looks like he got thrown under the bus without properly evaluating what he was saying. Now, I'd like to hear more. I mean, if I'm mistaken on that, I'd like to hear more. It doesn't ultimately take away from anything I'm saying, but it doesn't appear that they really considered these issues. And then Anastasius Bibliothecarius, later on, papal librarian, looks into this issue, and he's like, yeah, no, Honorius didn't teach monothelitism, and here's what we do with the Sixth Ecumenical Council. We accept the Ecumenical Council on faith and morals, but we recognize that outside of that, it could be an error. So on matters of fact, it could be an error. That's not some kind of second millennium distinction that theologians made up way later on. That's not a Catholic distinction that we made up way later on to explain papal infallibility. No. That's a distinction being used right there in the first millennium, not far after the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So I would say it's actually reasonable to say that that distinction was probably going on even in the minds of these council fathers in their condemnation of Honorius. Another thing here. I want to read something from William Carroll, who talks about the way in which Leo II condemned Honorius, because it can be interpreted in multiple ways, right? Was he condemning him as actually teaching heresy, or just merely holding to and allowing for heresy? I take the latter. I take the perspective that he allowed for it in the mind of Pope Leo II, even though I think he's wrong. He's historically wrong. But in his mind, he thinks Honorius allowed for it, but he did not actually teach it as the successor of St. Peter, because otherwise, why is he affirming and appealing to Petrine, his Petrine foundation, being a successor of St. Peter? And why is he speaking about the firmness of the Petrine See if his predecessor taught heresy as the successor of St. Peter? It just, none of it makes sense from operating from that perspective. But from the perspective that he thinks that, well, he was just in error insofar as he privately held to this and failed to, in his office, combat this. You know, he's derelict in his duties. I mean, that's certainly something a pope could be. He could fail to use his ministry for what it needs to be used for. He could be negligent. That's true. That's not inconsistent with papal infallibility. This is what William Carroll says on this. Writing in Latin to the Spanish bishops, he declared, that is Leo II, who is the one who confirmed the council's condemnation of Honorius. He declared that Honorius was condemned for not at once extinguishing the flames of heresy, but rather fanning them by his negligence. So not by his teachings, but by neglecting to put this thing out. By neglecting, in other words, he failed to perceive that a heresy was going on here, and he misunderstood what was going on. To King Erwig, he wrote that Honorius was condemned for negligence in not denouncing the heresy, and for using an expression which the heretics were able to employ to advancing their cause. By the way, I mean, Nicaea did the same thing, right? I mean, homoousios, which is a term that we use to say Jesus is consubstantial or of one nature with the Father, that was actually a term previously used by heretics. We purified it of its heretical meaning and then used it for God's glory, but that was a term that was originally used by heretics prior to Nicaea. So don't knock Honorius for using one will when heretics were using that term, when our own councils did the exact same thing, thereby allowing the faith to be stained. By these careful considerations, Pope St. Leo II substantially modified the sense of the council's decrees on Honorius. Pope Honorius, therefore, was never condemned for heresy by the supreme church authority, but only for negligence, allowing a heresy to spread and grow when he should have denounced it. I think he's right here. And I know some people have looked at that and they're like, I don't think that accounts for the evidence. Actually, I think it does. I think it does. In fact, it accounts for all of the evidence, because otherwise, how can Leo II appeal to Petrine foundation and the firm rock. It makes no sense. And also, again, the other bishops accepted. Honorius was good to go. They accepted papal infallibility, apostolic see, undefiled unto the end, including all the predecessors. It makes sense of all the data if we're saying that in the mind of Leo, he thinks he was merely negligent but didn't teach it in his office. Same for the council fathers. They thought that Honorius was negligent but did not necessarily teach it in his office as St. Peter. So I think these distinctions have to be kept in mind here. Otherwise, we're going to fall off track. What were those distinctions? Keep the distinction between material heresy, formal heresy, and teaching heresy in one's office. Keep those in mind. So last time here, one last time, I want to read the response from the professor and recap why it is woefully inadequate. He's asked about this issue with Pope Agatho teaching papal infallibility at the council, and his response is, it seems amazing that Pope Agatho can claim so unreservedly that his church had always kept the faith pure from any heresies. So he's acknowledging that the Pope taught that. Whatsoever, when his own predecessor, Pope Honorius, only 45 years earlier, was one who first asserted that there is only one will in Christ. Now, you see how I accounted for all of the data, but he is at a loss. As a church historian and professor, he can't figure it out. Well, I just gave you a way to reconcile it. And as we know, Pope Agatho's delegates ended up signing the doctrinal decree of the Sixth Council, which included a very clear condemnation of Pope Honorius. And every succeeding new Roman bishop renewed that condemnation until the 11th century, when it was dropped during the era of the Gregorian Reform. And I just explained to you how they could renew that and yet still maintain papal infallibility. And I did it in a way that was consistent with the Council Fathers and Leo II, and a way that's consistent with Vatican I papal infallibility. So I accept all of the Sixth Ecumenical Council. I accept all of it. I'm able to account for the whole thing. Whereas an Orthodox can't. They have to say, nope, I'm not going to accept its teachings on papal infallibility. They can't do that. They have to say, nope, doesn't make sense because Honorius was condemned. But I just give you a way that makes perfect sense in light of all the data. And it's the only way to make sense of all the data. And again, you could even still say that, oh, Michael, you're wrong. They did not make a mistake. Historically speaking, he was a material heretic. Historically speaking, he did embrace monothelitism. That's fine. That still takes away from nothing I've said here. Nothing. It still accounts for everything that I just said here. It still accounts for the distinction between a material heretic and teaching in one's office as the successor of St. Peter heresy. And also accounts for papal infallibility, because a pope being a material heretic doesn't disprove papal infallibility. That's reconcilable with Catholicism. So even if you say that I think Honorius did embrace monothelitism, even though you're historically wrong, you're factually wrong, but even if somehow you prove that you're right there, somehow against all of the evidence, it still takes away from nothing I've said. So I'm able to embrace all of these Sixth Ecumenical Council as a Catholic. An Orthodox has to pigeonhole it and say, nope, these teachings over here, the Council Fathers, they were wrong in their ecclesiology, but their Christology is good to go. Doesn't that bother you? Doesn't that sound wrong? I think this is a major problem for Eastern Orthodoxy. It's one of the biggest problems in their ecclesiology, in my opinion, because you're supposed to uphold the teachings of the council. Its teachings on ecclesiology and papal infallibility is just that. It's a teaching. Are you now going to say they taught error? If so, why can't you say that they also taught error in Christology? Upon what basis is one accepted and not the other? And at least be upfront in telling people that you think the council taught error and in fact embraced heresy here. Because it's not just error, it would be heresy, because Eastern Orthodox believe papal infallibility, most of them at least, believe papal infallibility is heresy. So one of your councils embraced heresy. You have to explain that. This is also why I find it interesting that Orthodox constantly want to talk about the Sixth Ecumenical Council to bring up Pope Honorius as if it disproves papal infallibility, which it doesn't. But it's like it's a double-edged sword because it actually undermines their own position, even though it doesn't undermine Catholicism. It undermines their own position because they have to admit that their own council accepted papal infallibility and thus embraced the heresy. Engagement with these things is what I would like to see an Orthodox professor and scholar doing. Unfortunately, I've yet to see that. So if there are any Orthodox scholars and professors out there who are able to engage everything I've just said here, I'd love to hear it. You're welcome to come on the show. You have an open invitation. You're welcome to come on. I will listen to you. I won't interrupt you. Just allow me to ask you some questions at the end of your presentation. So open invitation. Email me reasonandtheology.com if you are one of those scholars and professors in our Eastern Orthodox and you believe that you can answer everything that I just said. All right. You got an open invitation. Love to have you on. All right. That's going to do it. Y'all hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology if you want to support what I'm doing here. God bless. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at MaximusInstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time.